There is a moment, and perhaps you have already lived it, when you find yourself standing in the middle of a conversation, mouth open, words pouring out, desperately arranging and rearranging your reasons, your intentions, your justifications, and somewhere beneath the noise of your own explaining, something ancient and quiet inside you whispers, "Why are you doing this?" Not because the explanation is wrong, but because the very act of explaining reveals something you have not yet confronted about yourself. Carl Jung understood this silence. He understood what it costs a human being to keep performing their own innocence, and he understood what becomes possible the moment they stop. Jung spent his life mapping the interior world of the human psyche, not as a place of comfort or reassurance, but as a landscape of extraordinary depth and danger. He discovered that most of what drives us, what wounds us, what secretly governs our choices, lies not in the light of consciousness, but in the vast, unlit country he called the unconscious. And within that unconscious, he identified something every person carries, but few people have the courage to face directly: the shadow. The shadow, for Jung, was not simply the dark side of a person in any moral or theatrical sense. It was, in his own words, the sum of all those qualities, impulses, and images that the individual refuses to acknowledge about themselves. Everything that does not fit the story they are consciously trying to tell about who they are. It is the repository of repressed weakness, of unacknowledged desire, of capacities we have buried because society, family, or our own fragile self-image could not tolerate them. And crucially, it is also the place where enormous psychological energy is locked away, energy that, when unconscious, does not disappear, but instead leaks outward in ways we rarely recognize as our own. Now consider what happens when a person explains themselves compulsively, when they feel the constant need to justify their actions, defend their intentions, manage other people's perceptions of them. Jung would not have seen this as confidence. He would have seen it as a symptom, a signal that the persona that carefully constructed mask the ego wears to present itself to the world is under threat. And when the persona is under threat, the psyche panics, because for most people, the persona has been mistaken for the self. Jung wrote in 2 essays on analytical psychology that the persona is a compromise between the individual and society, a functional mask that allows us to navigate social life, to be seen in certain ways, to occupy certain roles. There is nothing inherently pathological about the persona. Every human being wears one. The problem arises when the individual identifies with it completely, when the mask becomes the face, when the role becomes the person. At that point, any challenge to the persona feels like an existential threat. Any misunderstanding, any criticism, any moment in which another person fails to see us the way we need to be seen, triggers not mild social discomfort, but something far more primal, a terror that feels like annihilation. And so the explaining begins. The long messages sent at midnight, revisiting a misunderstanding that happened days ago. The rehearsed offenses offered to people who were not even asking for one. The constant, exhausting labor of managing the image. Jung saw this pattern clearly. He understood that when a person is living primarily from the persona, rather than the self, they are in constant psychological servitude to the perception of others. They are not free. They are performing. And the performance never ends because the unconscious threat, the shadow, the parts of themselves they have refused to integrate, never stops pressing against the walls of the constructed identity. Here is what Jung observed about power, not power in the crude political sense, but psychological power, the inner authority that allows a human being to act from their deepest center, rather than from fear. He saw that this kind of power does not come from being understood. It does not depend on approval. It does not grow through convincing others of your worth. It grows through the process he called individuation. That long, often painful journey toward becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who you have been told to be, or who you have decided you must appear to be. Individuation, for Jung, was not a destination, but a process, a continuous and demanding engagement with the whole psyche, including its darkest and most uncomfortable regions. It required the individual to confront the shadow, not with judgment or disgust, but with honest recognition. To look at what they had projected onto others and ask, is this mine? to look at the qualities they most despise in other people and ask, where do I carry this within myself? This is not comfortable work. Jung never suggested it would be. He wrote that the encounter with the shadow is the apprentice piece of the individuation process, and that most people resist it entirely, preferring instead to keep the lights on in the narrow room of their consciousness and pretend the rest of the house does not exist. But what happens when a person begins this work in earnest? What happens when they stop defending the persona against every perceived attack and instead turn inward to examine what the attack has revealed? Something remarkable occurs. The compulsive need to explain begins to dissolve. Not because the person has become indifferent or cold, but because the inner foundation has shifted. They are no longer building their sense of self on the fragile architecture of other people's understanding. They have begun to locate themselves in something Jung called the self, the totality of the psyche, the organizing center that stands behind and beneath both the ego and the unconscious, integrating the light and the dark into a coherent wholeness. Jung described the self in Jungian and across his later work as the central archetype of order and meaning. In the psyche, not the ego, which is only the center of consciousness, but something far larger. He associated it with symbols of wholeness across cultures and throughout history. The mandala, the philosopher's stone, the divine child, the image of God within. The self, for Jung, was not a destination to reach, but a living reality to orient toward, a magnetic center that the ego, when it stops insisting on its own primacy, can begin to align with. When that alignment begins to happen, even partially, even imperfectly, the psychological center of gravity shifts. The person who once explained themselves to preserve the persona begins to feel less urgency around external validation. Not because they have become arrogant or isolated, but because they have found something interior to stand on. The ground beneath them has changed. They are no longer speaking from fear. They are speaking, when they choose to speak, from a different place entirely. Jung understood that silence, when it comes from this deeper center, is not withdrawal. It is not coldness. It is not defeat. It is the expression of what he called psychological wholeness, the capacity to be misunderstood without being destroyed, to be judged without being defined by the judgment, to allow another person's perception of you to be theirs without needing to rush in and correct it. This is the hallmark of someone who has done real work on themselves. Not someone who has perfected their image, but someone who has become genuinely less dependent on it. Consider how this appears in the lives of people Jung studied, both historically and in his clinical work. He observed, again and again, that the individuals who carried the deepest authority, not social status, not wealth, but genuine inner authority, were those who had undergone some encounter with their own darkness and had not been destroyed by it. They had met their shadow, faced the disowned parts of their psychology, and emerged from that encounter with a kind of gravity that no performance could replicate. They did not need to explain themselves because their actions arose from an integrated center rather than from an anxious periphery. The quality of their presence spoke before their words did. This is not something that can be manufactured. It cannot be achieved through communication techniques or confidence exercises or social strategy. Jung was unambiguous on this point. The development of psychological depth is an organic process, and it cannot be rushed, bypassed, or performed. What can be done, however, is the courageous and sustained act of turning toward the unconscious rather than away from it, of attending to the dreams that press against the edges of sleep, of noticing the emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to the situation and asking what they are pointing toward, of sitting with the discomfort of being misunderstood rather than immediately scrambling to resolve it. Each time a person chooses to endure rather than explain, something is strengthened in the psyche. Each time they resist the compulsion to manage another person's perception of them and instead direct that energy inward, toward greater self-knowledge, toward honest confrontation with what they carry in the darkness. The foundation of the self becomes more solid beneath them. The tension of opposites, that fundamental dynamic Jung saw operating at the heart of the psyche, begins to be held rather than split. And from the holding of that tension, from the refusal to collapse, the complexity of who one is, into a single acceptable image, something that Jung called the transcendent function emerges. A new and more integrated expression of the personality that could not have been reached by willpower or strategy alone. There is something deeply counterintuitive in this for the modern mind, which has been trained to believe that visibility equals power, that articulation equals strength, that the person who can best explain themselves wins. Jung would have looked at this belief with a kind of sorrow, because he understood where it leads. It leads to an infinite regress of performance, each explanation demanding another, each justification creating new vulnerabilities, each attempt to be fully seen by others, pushing the person further from the only kind of seeing that actually transforms, the seeing of oneself. The real power Jung pointed toward was not the power of persuasion or dominance. It was the power of the integrated psyche, the power of a human being who has made some honest peace with their own complexity, who carries their darkness consciously rather than projecting it outward, who can sit in the discomfort of ambiguity without reaching immediately for the comfortable simplicity of self-justification. This is the person whose silence carries weight. This is the person whose presence shifts the atmosphere of a room before they have said a single word, not because they have cultivated mystique or adopted a strategy of withholding, but because what comes through them is not performance. It is substance. It is, in Jung's language, the living reality of a psyche in genuine relationship with itself. And perhaps this is where you find yourself now, standing at the threshold of something. Perhaps exhausted by the explaining. Perhaps beginning to sense that the compulsive need to be understood is costing you something you cannot quite name. If so, Jung would say, follow that feeling. Not away from the difficulty, but deeper into it. Ask yourself what you are afraid others will see if you stop explaining. Ask yourself what truth about yourself you are still managing, still curating, still keeping carefully out of the light. Because there, in precisely that place of discomfort, is where the real work begins, and where the real power waits. If this kind of depth resonates with you, if you are drawn not to the surface of psychology, but to its most honest and demanding interior, then stay with this channel. The psychology of power, wealth, and identity exists for those who take the inner life seriously. Subscribe and bring your full attention. The ideas worth living for are rarely the comfortable ones.